cloud. All right. So welcome everybody. I'm glad we could do this. I've been looking forward to it for a while. And I'll talk about the inspiration behind it. But before I do that, let me pull up. I want to share because there's a few new faces, or at least newer faces, joining us today. So I just want to talk, give a quick brief on mortgage jobs as a whole. So I'm actually sharing in the chat our newer-ish Twitter page. So check that out. Most of you are probably already on our email list, I imagine. If you're not, let me know in the chat and I can add you to that. So Mortgage Jobs is an online community of startup community builders. So we talk about all sorts of cool stuff like this all the time, a couple times a month. We've got our Twitter page. I've been posting a little bit more to LinkedIn. We're going to try and start creating a newsletter. I'm in the process of pulling together a communications intern too to help us out with some of that content, because there's a lot of cool stuff going on about startup community building. And as Joe and I were talking about even last year, there's no community for people like us. We spend so much of our lives committed to helping build startup community, and yet there isn't like a genuine, no hidden agendas, just community of people like us to have these conversations. And because we're so geographically dispersed, it's very hard for us to get together in any other format on a recurring basis. We've had conversations where we've got like Ben, who's out in the UK, to people on the West Coast all together. And it's very difficult to do that in any kind of recurring basis, or to even make the time or financial commitment if you wanted to do it in person otherwise. So on Twitter is a space where we often post things you can kind of engage, and then we try to do one of these sorts of virtual things, maybe 3-4 times a month, 2 to 4 times a month or so, and various topics. We've got a couple other ones coming up. I think the next one, if I'm right, is a conversation with you, Joe, the next one is on the 10th. So a week from Friday, we're talking with Ben out in the UK about some of the startup community building he's done, and interesting little studio he's built around software development. And then on the 14th, we're doing an interview with you, Joe, about the work you did out in Oregon and are currently doing, which is some really cool, fun stuff too around IP. I was just talking about you yesterday with some folks at Cornell, hoping I can make an intro there too, by the way.
Awesome.
We'll see. Which is an example of the types of connections that happen all the time with this community, which is why I love it. So today we're going to talk about innovative models for angel funds, or really kind of, I would say more try to work through that and think about it, like created just a space for that conversation. So I was thinking about leading up to this, like, all right, how do we organize this? So here's my thinking. What led up to this even wanting to be a topic was that actually Olivia Nasser approached Mike DeRedita and I. So I'm the assistant director of the Keenan Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation and Creativity, I think is its full title, at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, so upstate New York. And my business partner and friend, Mike DeRedita, is the director. He'll be joining in a few minutes. And we've been involved in upstate community building for last myself around 10 years, Mike 15 plus. Nasser Ali, a former business partner, a good friend for a long time, and runs Upstate Venture Connect with Olivia, approached us about wanting to form a new angel fund here in Central New York, because there really isn't one anymore. And so we were thinking about that for a while and actually came up with an idea for a different type of model. And we're like, oh, we should have a conversation about that because it could be really innovative. And so that's what made me want to pose this. So I thought in terms of format, I think I'd like to take the hot seat model for it. I think that'd be a good, somewhat organized fashion of hosting this, where I'm going to put myself in the hot seat, kind of propose what we're thinking about in terms of a fund model. But At the same time, I don't want to limit it to just feedback on that model. So as we're kind of going around and you have an opportunity to talk about it, please take the opportunity to think broader than just the model I'm sort of throwing out there and commenting on that. If you have ideas or things that you've explored or want to explore or want to get feedback on or whatever, take your time to put that out there as well. But I thought organizing it in this sort of hot seat format, which I'll explain for those who aren't familiar, is just a good way to organize a conversation, so it's not just some disorganized free for all, if that makes sense. So, all right. So hot seat format, basically, for those who aren't familiar, especially for those who don't have their video on, I'm going to need your thumbs up or not as to whether or not you want to participate actively. So cool. I got a good thumbs up right there. Or sit and observe. But if you would like to participate, the way that'll work is I'm going to take a moment to kind of pose, well, usually you pose the problem, but in my case, I'm going to kind of make a pitch for what we're thinking about as a new innovative approach to a seed fund in our region. And then we're going to kind of go around the circle. Each of you will have a couple minutes to provide uninterrupted thoughts and feedback. Again, don't feel free to expand beyond just direct feedback on what I'm talking about to more general things, or even throw ideas out there that you have. We'll go around until everyone who's interested has a time to talk. Then it'll give me a chance to go back and ask direct questions to any one of you on the feedback that you had. And then after that, we can kind of open up for more general conversation and discussion from that. So if I could, we got several of you, any of you who are currently not have your screen on, if you would like to participate in the conversation in that regard, if you could please, at the very least, just turn your screen on for a moment to let me know. That way I know who wants to participate. So I got you, Joe. Yep, I saw that. Anyone else? I see Steve or Caden. I don't know who Firefly's note takers, but any of you guys? No pressure. Okay, cool. So we'll stick to that. All right. All right. So I'll give you, here's what we were thinking about it. So Mike and again, he'll join in a minute, as will Martin, actually. And we were thinking a lot about seed funds and thinking first in terms of the traditional structure, for-profit type of fund, where you get a whole bunch of high net worth individuals to put a fair amount of capital together into a fund mechanism. So rather than like an angel group or anything like that, or really thinking of it more as a seed fund where people have some minimal commitment, and then there's SPVs and sidecars that you could put together as well, with a traditional 2 and 20 model. So you would have the 2% management fee and all that stuff. We started thinking about that, and the challenges we kept running into were that for one, it was like the whole mechanism, the for-profit mechanism, both as a manager and as the investor, really starts forcing you into the traditional VC lane, where you're really looking at those like your unicorn hunting kind of mentality a lot of times to make the economics work. And at the same time, you're talking long time horizons. Any of you guys who have either invested in or built a company like that know it's a longer term sort of play to make all of that happen. So there was a lot of like just negative, sort of, I don't want to say negative side effects to that we were like, I'm not sure that if you really think about it in terms of a community building perspective makes sense, especially looking at the types of entrepreneurs we have here. Because one of the things we don't want to ignore is sort of the second and third order effects of that, meaning you invest in one entrepreneur, which has a network effect to other entrepreneurs, as well as the fact that they may fail and then they have a much better successful opportunity the second or third time around. And just thinking about it from those types of effects that you can have. We're thinking more in terms of a nonprofit fund. So first, a nonprofit fund, an actual fund that we could raise philanthropic dollars for. There'd be a management fee associated with that so that people can run it, but no carried interest. And right off of the bat, some of the things that we thought was appealing about that were, one is there isn't the same sort of incentive structure to make capital work. If you run a fund, you need to make capital work to make your IRR. You need to make capital work because you've made that mandate to investors. So you're kind of in this forced mechanism to hunt for deals on a very timely basis. And sometimes that can force a certain type of decision making. So there's that whole mechanism. Plus, it's forcing you a lot of times into unicorn hunting exclusively. Whereas we're finding a lot of entrepreneurs, some might want to do an interesting real estate thing that can really revitalize an area or something like that. There's a lot of lifestyle entrepreneurs that we'd like to invest in and think that they can have some impact. And maybe that leads to additional successful outcomes as well if they leave a business or become an investor. But the other thing we find a lot around here, I classify it as early stage private equity. So these are companies that are not really venture backable. They're never going to be a unicorn, but they could be a very successful tens to maybe even $100 million business, something that a PE would eventually find interest in. But there's not a traditional financial path for them. They often grow organically. Maybe they get an SBA loan or something like that, but there isn't the same ecosystem of investors set up to invest in that class of companies. And we see a lot of that here, including software companies around here. And they're just not as very much a good fit for VC. So we thought with a nonprofit sort of structure, it gives us the ability to have that flexibility to invest in all of those various things and really measure impact. Have the type of time horizon, right, where we can get, you only really need to, if we want to make an evergreen fund, a 1x or plus return over time. And look at it that way. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to pitch sort of high level. I'll leave it at that. So Mike, you just joined us. I'm basically pitching a nonprofit fund idea at Abstract and doing it.
I heard.
I see that.
I'm caught up.
We're on the hot seat model. So essentially you're going to go around the horn to get feedback here on that. But I also instructed everybody to say, hey, don't just limit it to feedback on that idea. If you have other ideas of innovative things, you can put it out there too. So, okay, cool. Now I'm going to go around for some one-on-one feedback. Who do I want to start with? Tough call. Jack, I'll start with you. I'm really curious of your thoughts, especially someone who's currently running angel investment vehicles.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to the model. I think you had some points that really kind of hit home. Is especially if we're focused on like our group, we're focused regionally. It does limit the opportunity for potential unicorns. There's only so the deal flow is much more limited, and there's a lot of the companies that that we're working with. Hopefully they're going to be nice businesses and provide a financial return for their investors, but they're not likely to become unicorns. So I think realizing that that's the case is important. I guess one of the questions that I have is, they're still, even though they're not potential unicorns and they're a little bit more kind of quote traditional businesses in some cases, they're still high, they're startups. If they're coming to us, that means they're still high risk. And can the kind of the VC model that 1 or 2 out of the 10 are going to make the fund. How do the economics work if you're funding companies that have less upside potential, but how do you then insulate against the downside? And I think, as you mentioned, you don't need to necessarily get as high a return to maintain the fund on an evergreen basis, but still, I think the economics could be a challenge. Mm-hmm. Then a question. So as you mentioned, certainly can raise from philanthropic funders. Is that all you'd be raising from? Or are you looking to also raise from high net worth individuals or what have you that you do have at least some sort of an expectation of a return.
Cool. So I can't answer those questions until after we go around. That's the hot seat format, but I'm writing them down so that I will later. Cool. Zach Marshall.
Yeah, hey, thanks.
Good to see you, by the way.
Good to see you too. I've been having audio problems. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Cool. So I like your idea. I think you can achieve something pretty similar without using non-for-profit model. And I think the targets that I've seen, and I can introduce you later to some of my peers who are currently doing this. It seems to me like the companies that you'd want to fund are probably early enough that you don't need to raise $100 million. You're talking about a fund that's somewhere in the low millions, maybe 10 million or something. The second, as you mentioned, companies that might be bootstrapped or might be like, no, sorry, you didn't say bootstrap. They might not have that big top tier outcome. To Jack's point, if you are taking, VC style risk, right, and flooding a bunch of non-returned cash, like non-debt cash into a business that maybe maxes out on a $10 million ARR, like, will that return the fund for the failures? The answer is probably no. And so I've seen two versions of this. One, companies who still want to do high risk, they've started creating these things called rolling funds, where the fund resets every quarter, and the LPs subscribe. They can always cancel their subscription, but like my buddy has one where every LP subscribes $4,000 per quarter, and it's kind of forever. And they can cancel anytime they want. And then every quarter they have a certain amount of investments they want to make, but if they don't make the investment, the money moves on to the next quarter, sort of a thing. That allows you to not be in a rush to get these unicorns to only make smart decisions, but it's also still the beginning of a venture-backed like business model. The second one is a company by Tyler Tregus called the Calm Company Fund. Calm is in I'm so chill. And their whole idea is we want to be the kind of like betting company that isn't PE, isn't an SBA loan. We're still going to give money on founders. We're still going to take that risk, but we're going to dig in as a partner and really understand their business, but we don't expect them to have home runs. And so their fund is based on a thing they invented called a SEAL, S-A-E-L, SEAL, S-E-A-L, whatever, shared earnings agreement. And so rather than taking equity, they do a shared earnings agreement, and I went through the whole process with them. The contract is pretty robust. And so you definitely have to find companies that don't believe they're going to be billion-dollar companies. Because if the founder thinks they're going to be a billion-dollar company, there's no way that a SEAL would make sense, right? But it is two ways to fund. Like, these are two different ways that you could fund kind of, or create a fund that lowers risk on LPs because they can kind of pull out when they want to, or in the one case, looks at smaller companies. And then the last thing I would just ask is, as you're building this fund, I can imagine a hurdle would be if a company thinks they're going to be a $10 million company or a $20 million company over 5 years, why would they not bootstrap? Why would they not get an SBA loan or traditional financing? Take working capital against future revenue, those kind of things. And if the answer is, well, it's so high risk, we don't know if this is a real product or not, I would side with Jack, where now you've got two risks. One, that it can't get big enough, and two, that we're not sure it would work.
Awesome feedback, man. Thank you. Lots of follow-on questions. Olivia.
Cool. Thanks for organizing this, James. Very timely discussion. I really want to, if you guys are seriously interested in looking into this for Central New York and upstate, very interested in being part of that conversation. So I've had similar conversations with Nasser, and obviously because of my experience working with StartFast and everything, I've kind of given this a lot of thought. So I think generally speaking, it probably depends on what you think the goals are broadly for the fund. I mean, if you look at it from like a community building perspective and trying to maximize the number of investments and maybe different companies that you think can help build the community, there's a couple of different maybe approaches you could take into looking at that. So One would be like if you're looking at like maybe traditional, like smaller, like not maybe high growth businesses, like companies. I know I just recently talked to a company called Honeycomb Credit in Pittsburgh. They're basically a crowdfunding platform for local businesses to raise money from community investors. So just all authorized through like the Jobs Act and everything. So I think that model is kind of interesting because it allows, you know, people that are interested in seeing changes within their own communities, like either if like new restaurants or coffee shops or whatever it might be. So just kind of throwing that out there is something to consider. You know, and I think if you're looking at in terms of shifting gears, raising from different types of investors, a fund that I'm part of one of my groups, they're raising like a smaller, like a $10 million fund. And they are trying to get like smaller buy-ins from investors. It's a traditional model, but instead of kind of going after like high net worth individuals, they're like lowering the bar that people can put in for their fund, and basically kind of going after like sophisticated investors as opposed to like traditional high net worth individuals. I don't know, just again, throwing that out there as another thing to kind of consider from the fundraising strategy. Broadly speaking too, from StartFast 2, we've seen a lot of success with our SPVs. So again, I think a lot of people are interested in kind of angel investors, that sort of model, and in investing through SPVs in specific companies. What other notes do I have on this? I think if you're looking at, I mean, I definitely don't think I agree with kind of the comments you made about unicorn hunting, because I think there's a lot of other funds that do that in our area. So I think one thing you could do is if you are taking this kind of community approach where you're just, you know, focusing on companies in upstate that maybe to other points that were made by other folks, there might not be as many kind of unicorns in the mix just because you're limited based on the geography. How you could get around that is maybe just like, I mean, you have relationships, I do, all of us do, right? With funds in the area and just co-investing with bigger funds so that you can get a piece of their deals too, to kind of at least make sure that you're able to, you know, return to investors. I think that's all my notes. Yeah, that's all I have for now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Joe, I'm going to say Joe Millam and then we'll go to Joe Morschik.
Thanks. Milam, forgive me. It's
I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
Nice to meet you, by the way, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's important because I'm here in Austin, Texas, and I've only been here 8 years, but one of my ancestors is recognized as the first hero and the first martyr of the Texas Revolution. His name is Ben Milam, and so getting Milam name pronounced properly in Texas is important. So sorry about that.
I'm just a New Yorker. It's in my blood to offend people.
That's all right. I have a thick skin on that. Yeah, I mean, I've been posting some things in the chat box again, and which is the research behind what I'm going to share. I don't, you know, my background, I ran a multifamily office. I was a portfolio manager, securities analyst. We did our own securities selection, stock picking, did our own research, and created consistent alpha for our old money private clients for 20 years. And so that's the philosophy that I approached all of these questions you're asking, is from a portfolio manager's view, because to me, the single issue that causes the chronic underperformance of the asset class, the difficult return experiences, the inefficiencies in how we allocate capital to worthy innovative ventures, right? Worthy should be defined as, can they create value for their shareholders, not is it going to be a unicorn? That's a narrative that's been driven by what is now finally become recognized more widely as the flaws in the venture fund model itself. And if you've all seen Sequoia's announcement last fall about their stating that the venture model is outdated, that is a fact. There's no doubt about that. It's finally now become more publicly recognized. So this is the context in which I'll offer up my opinion or my thoughts on this. And I've given you illustrations. You can think Moneyball, right? Moneyball is such a great framework to think of this challenge, because think of the old baseball scout that the Moneyball phenomenon basically disintermediated by showing that their claims to be able to spot a good deal, right? To spot a bonus, a good high school athlete that's worth signing a big contract to, that really won't mature into a professional baseball player for 3 to 5 to 7 years, not unlike the model of the venture funding. And their claims of being able to spot that based on their network and their history and their experience and all that nonsense was a false narrative. It was just a conventional narrative until Moneyball came along. The same is true in the venture asset class. The data is clear on this. The research, as I've cited, is clear on this, is that the best way to think of allocating capital is a Moneyball approach and managing risks to optimize the outcome of the portfolio, not any one transaction. Managing risk is the critical component that's been sorely lacking in the approach to the venture asset class. Swinging for the fence with other people's money is not an investment strategy. It doesn't result in repeatable alpha, risk-adjusted returns. It also, the analog nature of the whole model, where you have to have the entrepreneur come pitch the investor, which is just patently silly. I mean, when we did our securities research, I didn't have to have the managements of Intel and GE and IBM come to my office and pitch me on their company before I bought the stock and put it in my clients' portfolios, because I had good data. And that is one of the important points. Michael asked a very good question about one of the illustrations I put up there is data-driven portfolio management. Well, what's the right data? And that is the key issue. I wouldn't even approach trying to deploy capital unless you're getting good information on all the companies that you're evaluating in due diligence before you assemble a portfolio. And that portfolio needs to be assembled with multiple rounds in mind. The number one determining factor by all the research that's out there, and this has been confirmed by multiple parties, the number one determining factor of entrepreneurial success or failure is not the conventional due diligence criteria that everybody likes to talk about, quality of the team, the size of market, all that sort of stuff. It's timing is the number one, over 40% determining factors of outcomes. Entrepreneurial outcomes is freaking timing. Well, the only way to manage timing is to deploy capital over multiple time periods. In the public market, that's called dollar cost averaging, admitting you can't time the market or time any one investment decision to be optimal. So you have to incorporate staged capital deployment in your strategy. Otherwise, you're gambling with yours or somebody else's money, which is, as a fiduciary, money manager, investment professional, I abhor the gambling behavior wrapped around an investing patina, which is what typically goes on in this space. So look, be careful what you ask for. I've got an opinion on this. I've been studying this a very long time. I was out on Sand Hill Road in the mid-90s before the internet commercialized, running this investment firm. And right there at 3000 Sand Hill, I managed money for Larry Cincini, his personal money, and some of the VCs at Sequoia and some of the others around, Silicon Valley Bank executives, just because of where we were at and the firm that I joined that eventually I took over in the early 90s. But long story short, I've seen this for over 25 years. The patterns repeat themselves. It's just a new crop of investors gambling, but the outcomes are always the same. And it's a definition of insanity is repeating the same behavior and expecting different outcomes. And thankfully, we're now seeing a serious conversation. Really, there's several of us have been talking about this for a number of years. David Teton is one out of Harvard's Business School. He's been a real thoughtful guy. He's got a really good research library on a lot of these sort of tactics. But ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, establishing a seed portfolio is critical. Yes, it's got to be low fee because you want to attract the investor's capital. It's table stakes, if you use a poker metaphor. It's absolute table stakes. It should be about 15% of your capital to put it in a broadly diversified portfolio seed stage company. So you can get on the cap table, get on the pro rata rights on the ones that will eventually become the good deals that you don't even know who they're going to be. It's too bloody early. And maintain proper diversification. Also, for taxable investors, one of the great oversights, and don't get me started, I could spend hours on this, is the qualified small business stock tax incentives that de-risks the investment process. QSBS, I put a link to the two QSBS laws. One is 1244, which is the original one, which passed in 1959, when the venture industry under the Small Business Investment Act launched the venture industry in 1959. So it was a specific tax incentives to stimulate investment startups. by de-risking the transaction for taxable investors. It's part of the first, now under the current law, $1 million that goes into a startup. It allows losses to be written off against taxable income, and a better write-off than giving an equivalent amount of money to charity. And wealthy people give a lot of money away to charity. And so you can invest in a QSBS qualified deal, and even if it fails, it's a better financial transaction than if you gave an equivalent amount of money to charity, because it's an above the line deduction. It's above the adjusted gross income line deduction. So it lowers your taxable income dollar for dollar. Unlike a charitable contribution, it's an itemized deduction. So long story short, there's a variety of ways to de-risk the process, deploy capital well without thinking you can predict the future or pick winners, and deliver alpha for investors, regardless of your investment theme. Regardless of your investment thing. I don't care whether it's blockchain, female entrepreneurs, a geographic focus, which is called place-based impact investing. That's an important criteria. Something we've been working on a long time is optimizing how you can build funds to attract institutionally rigorous community foundation dollars, donor advised fund dollars into a community-focused venture strategy and deliver them alpha and make them feel good about the impact they're having on their community. So these are the topics. That's the research. I put my contact information. I've got to run here in just a couple of minutes, but I got a ton of research. I've been working on this for over 25 years, trying to bring public market rigor, risk management, portfolio management rigor to the capital allocation process, the venture fund, how we fund innovation. It's grossly flawed. As evidenced by all these conversations, the struggle of different communities around the country that has great entrepreneurs that can't get an audience, and yet stupid business plans get funded just because they're in New York or Silicon Valley. That's a misallocation of resources. It's a broken system. It was fine 30 and 40 years ago, but it's long since past its sell-by date. So anyway.
I think I'm going to reach out, especially since you have to run, Joe. I want to follow up with you for a follow-up conversation if I can, if you don't mind, because there's a lot to dig into.
I'm an open book on this. I'll get a bit professorial for you and probably bend your ear more than most people want to learn. But I'm anal about doing your homework before you step off and doing anything, particularly if you're going to run somebody else's money. You damn well better do your homework first. And
Yeah,
that's sort of my mentality. So all my opinions are supported by research, not by me wetting my finger or because it's what everybody's saying or doing. Okay.
These links are great.
I know, they're awesome. I can't wait to dive into it. It's
happy to share. I like I said, I'm an open book guy. I got tons more than that.
I'm sure. Just even the high level data and the analysis that's done here are great. Tells the story, right? Tells a lot of the story.
Yeah, well, that research, that compilation of research is the piece, and I keep adding to it and updating it when new research comes out. So that compilation of research on an optimized venture strategy, there's links to the underlying research. So that can take you a week to digest. So I would encourage you to start there. The best piece is the first piece linked, which is called The Future of Venture Capital. And it's a brilliant study of the industry by an independent consulting firm called InnoSight, which was Clayton Christensen, Mr. Disruptive Innovation. That was his consulting firm. And they were hired a couple of years ago by Deep Pocket in Singapore to study the venture industry before this big family wanted to go spend a lot of money. And so they just did an objective consulting analysis, and that report summarizes their work, and it's brilliant. I couldn't agree more. I wish, it's like I paid for the damn thing, because they did analyze it without the agenda of the existing venture industry's perspective or the perverse incentives of people trying to invest in venture capital and get rich. It was a proper analysis of the industry. And all the other research you'll see is sequentially ordered. It supports all their conclusions. And that was one of the last pieces that came out. So all of this stuff supports the observations and conclusions from that consulting report. And I would challenge anybody, any VC, and I've tried to get VCs to challenge me on it, and they won't do it, as to why they think differently than that report. Don't argue with my opinion. Tell me why you feel differently than what that observation is, and all this other supporting research. I have been published on some white papers in Institutional Investors Journal of Private Equity on what we built to address some of these issues, and it's at the very bottom of that piece. I didn't put ours up top because once you read everything else, you realize what we built is supported by all that research you just read. So.
That's awesome. Right. I can't wait to dive into that.
Folks, and reach out to me anytime you want for more, because I
will. I copy your email address, so I'm going to follow up with you right after this. I'm sure Mike and I will want to dive into that. So Joe Merschik, I'm curious of your.
Oh man, I've got so many thoughts. I wrote so many notes as I listen to everybody. First, I love the idea of an evergreen model as opposed to sort of a typical 10-year 220. This is really the idea that you could actually have a broader fund and invest in more things.
Mhm.
I think would be really, really useful. And this is whatever you build has to be responsive to the community that you're in. Like in Oregon, we used to keep getting invited to how do we get more seed funds started in the state, and sort of the work group, the yearly work group thing. We'd show up and they'd be like, okay, you guys run a seed fund, and how should we get more seed funds? We're like, what we actually need is a backstop for collateralized CDFI loans. We had food businesses, product businesses, and like a whole bunch of people that don't have collateral. They want to actually start a food business. What they need is a loan, and they can get that from a CDFI if they have collateral. Backstop them. Or you can actually see like part of your fund doing small angel investments, but also backstopping and doing connections to CDFIs. So you're not necessarily wanting to take the whole bite, particularly if you're doing businesses that aren't venture scalable. You can come up with something that's a little bit more nuanced. I also saw this when we were working. Half the people I met with, it was just the general level of financial unsophistication. They're just unsophisticated. They're not ready to have the conversations because they don't understand how to build the business, how to run it. I could actually probably record myself talking to people about how to use debt on, say, a food business for operational expense on inventory. Like I have I draw the same diagram again and again. I can do it in my sleep, and it's like you have to teach people how to use capital correctly and use different pools of capital correctly in order to actually be effective. And if that education becomes more widespread, which we saw when we started doing the work after a couple of years, that seeped out in the community, they became more sophisticated, and then the access to the different types of capital became clearer to them of what they would use each one for and when they would use each one. Doing an evergreen fund that had this model that was like, okay, you're at this stage, you get this, we'll do this little part and help you with this other piece. At this stage, it's something else. That way you don't have everyone coming to you saying, I'm starting a business, I need VC. And you're having that conversation where you're going, no, you don't need VC. What you need is capital. And then you start pulling it apart. It's like that happens. So whatever you do, that educational component of educating the people that are taking investment is crucial. So I wrote down some notes. We had a disastrous crowdfunding push in Oregon. They actually did this crowdfunding thing in Oregon. It was a community crowdfunding thing, and it was an absolute disaster, total disaster. And I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but I met with two companies, and in one instance with this company, after talking to them for about 20 minutes, I had them leave my office. I didn't tell them why. I was like, please leave my office, go talk to your lawyer. They were committing securities fraud. And I was like, I don't want to talk to you about this anymore. You guys shouldn't be talking to me. It was really, really scary, the lack of education that the group that promoted the crowdfunding did, because these people didn't know any better. And they were literally committing serious securities fraud and opening themselves up to a lot of exposure, which was kind of disappointing because it was a really good idea that was poorly implemented. Nonprofit board, if you have one, be careful of who you put on the board. Nonprofit board members have incentives, whatever those might be. And that can be something that over a number of years, if you're not really careful, the agenda of each individual board member can actually skew where you're going. It can also turn into just board meetings that are going nowhere. A bunch of people talking over each other about what their particular agenda is and not actually being able to align on it. What else did I write down? Oh, tax incentives. So this is this thing that just popped in my head near the end. When I was working in Oregon, the city of Eugene reached out to me, and they actually had tax credits they got for some project they did for installing lighting. And it's a city, they can't use them. They literally reached out to me like, hey, do any of your friends want to buy these tax credits? Where they just, so I was, I didn't take any money for it, but it's like a broker. I just reached out to a bunch of my friends, and they're like, wait, so I can buy $500,000 for $400,000? Yeah, okay. So they literally did transactions. They were buying unused tax credits. So there's like these pools of money sitting around that there wasn't a mechanism for these entities that don't have to pay taxes to shed their tax credits in an effective way. So when I think of something that's like a nonprofit evergreen fund in an ecosystem, you could actually take a survey of your ecosystem and say, well, what do we have? If you have an awesome CDFI, and in Oregon, we had Community Lending Works and Craft 3, which both were awesome. Like if you have something that's a good CDFI that's already really good at doing that, you take advantage of that. If you don't, then you might have to say, okay, well, that's the piece that we need to build out. So it's like really trying to supplement what else you have that's functional, and what's not functional, sort of fill in the gaps. But the idea of having a big evergreen fund that's just a pool of money that you can actually do debt with, purchase a building, do revenue notes, do some seed investing. By Joe, you could actually do all these. If you could do several things at once, you could possibly come up with a model that was effective that actually could return. I think it's really, really important that it returns. I have seen, I gotta be careful because this is recorded. I have seen sort of spray and pray money, state money, go into nonprofits that were just supporting startups. And what we saw were a lot of startups that were poorly capitalized. Really crappy notes on the cap table that we had to clean up. And in a couple instances, we were just like, wait around, like we're going to wait for your eventual down round, because they got overcapitalized, and it's like they're always trying to raise, and they're doing okay companies, but I'm like, no, you have a down round in your future because you overcapitalized it there, with these quasi grant investments, and you're going to have to readjust. And as soon as you actually get back to where you should be on your capital ladder with the valuation that's not stupid, we're in. And I think that again, to the level of sophistication, there were unsophisticated people deploying the money to people that were unsophisticated receiving the money, that just led to this thing that made them downstream uninvestable. So I think there's a lot of dangers there when you're talking about nonprofits, as whoever is running it has to be really good to make sure you don't run into those things. And there's also that when you actually start growing a large number of companies, sort of the medium size, then you're just moving it up a level. So right now that in rural areas, people are struggling and they can't get seed investment or any investment to get off the ground. And what you see is when you start making those investments, then you have some companies progressing to the next round. And then instead of having them shut down because survival of the fittest isn't at the seed level, survival of the fittest comes at the Series A or then at the PE level. There's just not enough capital to go around. So if you're not developing the ecosystem all the way down to ensure that there's some sort of stability when they actually get to that endpoint, then eventually you'll have a capital gap. And that actually might end up being something that is far from the future. You just have to anticipate, but at some point there will be a capital gap for the ones that are working, for the bigger pools of capital. And this is both on the debt side and on the seed/angel side and on the venture side. It seems, and I always look at them differently. Like you have your VC path models, you have your angel kind of ones that are going to turn into 3Xs or 1Xs with dividends or revenue notes, and you have your food businesses and small product businesses that do fine with debt, provided they can get off the ground. And just being able to kind of address all of them at once, I think will give you the best bet. So those are my thoughts. Just like if you try and do one thing, you will plug a hole in the capital gap in your region. And there will be others. So like when we did this with our fund, we recognized we were closing one gap, and we're involved in a lot of conversations about all the other gaps, which we said, yeah, that's not our bag. That's not what we do. We solve this particular problem for this particular group in this particular area, and that's it. Because we couldn't be all things to all people. So hopefully that was coherent.
Very helpful. Wow, I wish we had more than 12 minutes remaining.
This is not long enough.
I know. I know, but I feel bad stealing 2 hours from people in order to make it sufficient.
This is part one.
Part one, yeah, we'll have a subsequent conversation. So Martin, I know you joined late, but we're really just we're doing a hot seat on basically what we talked about yesterday over the phone, actually, with Mike, about that nonprofit fund approach. You probably gathered that. I don't know if you have any feedback you want to share right now. Take it away.
Well, I'd almost want to make sure you've made your rounds so I can have the benefit of whatever. Yeah, so I do have a couple of thoughts, but I want to hear more before I say anything. So just give me a few minutes as you get, if everyone else has already had a chance to speak, and if not, then
Everyone that has wanted to speak has had a chance. So,
all right.
you.
You know, and I apologize. I really wanted to be here for this whole thing, but there have been other things on my horizon that I had to tend to that interfered with this particular timing. When I think about the getting other people engaged to help put the capital in the marketplace that we all want to see happen, we know that what holds people back is measuring not just their thickness of their wallet, but they're identifying the use of their time. All right, it's the combination of those two things, and we tend to think about the thickness of the wallet more than the willingness to engage their time. And whenever we're talking angels, I really start tilting more towards the time side of it. And it's a lot easier to have a group of people that are ready to make that time commitment, have the fund be successful, is more important than the thickness of a few people that come in, maybe put some dollars in, but don't put any time in. Those outcomes are usually suboptimal. And so when I kind of parse through that, I go back to some of the things that I put in More Good Jobs Chapter 7. The biggest handicap that we've seen across the different funds that we helped start from UVC, and each region has a little different flavor on it. Some of them are, are represented here. Jack's obviously carrying the freight in Buffalo, and we've had our challenges that we've worked through in Central New York with the Seed Capital Fund of Central New York. We have Eastern New York Angels. So we had a hand getting started. The Hudson Valley group that Johnny Lahane put together. We've seen the movie a few times. All right, and when I think about the best practices that have made the difference, the challenges that have been similar in every one of those launches of funds, the biggest obstacle was always that individual investors always want to gravitate towards only funding local companies, and learning how to get angel investors to see the value of it's number one, most important for the fund to be successful. In order for the fund to be successful, we don't want to limit ourselves to thinking only about local companies. Let's find the best companies. That's like, most important outcome was, at least from our perspective, was learning how to navigate expectations for incoming investors from day one, to not to say that they want to ignore local companies, but not say the only companies we invest in are going to be local companies, because that is not a recipe for success. And that by looking at things on a regional basis, as we are, we're actually doing, and we see now over time, it's taken years, but we've seen the benefit of cross-fertilization from these funds now starting to help each other and co-invest in deals that Fund A might have started with that first round, but as the company grows, getting the lift that comes from other funds that can be supportive. Rochester and Buffalo actually working together. So in Start Fast, putting things into the pipeline has really made the difference. So, for me, how we go about setting investor expectations out of the starting block is the most important thing that we can manage. That, along with how do we get time commitment, the time commitment from whoever is investing. Passive investors will only go so far in early stage investment. When we know we have to have a portfolio, you can only make money in this with a portfolio, and having people understand portfolio theories. And that angel investors that first come in don't generally understand how to look at this from a portfolio standpoint, and the willingness to take on an investment, knowing that every investment we write isn't going to work. It just doesn't work that way in early stage investing. So if we get people to buy into that on the front end and get their time commitment and get beyond looking at just local companies, if the expectations are there along those lines, then the odds of success go way up. And the funds that have been able to fire on all those cylinders are the ones that are producing the best results in the angel world in upstate New York. That would be my observation.
Well, much, yeah. And reflections, yeah, as you were saying that on the book too. That was helpful, as were your comments yesterday.
Yeah. The ideas are the easy part. It's the execution that's hard. All right. And those of us that have been involved in the execution side know what I mean. It's like ideas are easy, but when it comes down to it, we all want to take the checks. We got somebody ready to give us a check, and our ability to say, maybe it's not right for you to invest in this fund because we want the check. We're trying to get that investor. But investors that write a check without signing up for these expectations that I'm suggesting may not be the right investor. And then that ends up hurting funds more than helping, even though we're desperate for taking on as much capital as we can.
So I have a lot of follow-on questions for a lot of people. I think I'm going to end up taking most of them offline, or maybe online into other formats, either via Twitter or email or something like that, to continue the conversation because of time constraints. But Mike, you being my partner in all of this, I'm gonna tag team you and say, what questions do you have for other people while we've got them?
So I do have one question that's on top of my mind, because it's more of a hypothesis than anything else, is that I think when it comes to these funding models and funds themselves, and this actually speaks directly to Martin's point about time, is that people seem to have it backwards. It's money first, and really it seems to be about coaching, networking, community building, right? That's what it is. The money's fuel. Pro basketball team has great coaches and great players and good contracts, right? It's the coaching and the players that win the championships. So, I guess that's my question there. Am I off on that? Right? These funds aren't about raising money. Funds are about getting great coaches together and great networks together first. Then thinking about the resources and fuel on the money side. Otherwise, it's a fool's errand or luck.
Right. No, you're completely right, but it's iterative in the sense that it's really hard to get a critical mass that you really want out of the starting gate. It's hard. It's, it's a chicken and egg scenario. It's like you need a certain amount of scale in order to be able to deploy and have the impact that you want. But once you're in the game, then being able to set and hold to the desired standard is something that all of us that are in that execution side have to contend with. And I would say it's like just like when you go and you're making hiring decisions for your team. The more that you are aligned with the individual you're trying to hire, with what their goals are, the more that you're going to have a better outcome from that relationship. And that logic holds for investors. They come to you, you're desperate, just like you're desperate for talent when you're trying to build a company. But when you sacrifice on your standards a little bit because, I just got to fill this slot, it gets you into trouble in the angel side, just like it does when you hire that employee that you're saying, I just really need somebody right now. All right. It's the same kind of outcome. And you live to regret it. All right. And especially when they're bad investors, and sometimes that happens in the angel world, they can drag you down. All right. And then it's not just the fact that they can be disruptive in terms of your time, but they can badmouth you, that can further inhibit your ability to raise capital from others. So holding to a standard is what's important. And part of the alignment that I find to be very helpful when I'm out there talking to investors and encouraging them to come into funds, especially those that are in my generation and who have the financial capacity, is the reminder that this will keep you young, including the message to boomers or those approaching, even in their late 50s, let's say. They might feel that they're challenged from being able to keep up to date with technology. And there is no better way to stay current in what's going in the world. And I will tell them, it's like, you want to be relevant to your kids? Start paying attention to this. This is a great opportunity. And you can, just by hanging out and applying yourself with time, you are going to become current in a way that will be meaningful and fun. That's an appealing message to a lot of people who might be at that stage where they're comfortable in other stuff. This is a new kind of challenge, but it requires the investment of their time. That's an expectation we can set with those that we're trying to recruit as angels.
Mike, I'm going to sort of respond to your question as it relates to coaching, because I agree with you. And given the work that I've been doing over the past decade, I find myself coaching both startups to get them more sophisticated, to be ready to accept money and not blow it, and then educating potential investors. These were people that had owned a business or had worked at a bank, but had absolutely no idea how a startup software company made money, or how they could make so much money. So it's a dual-sided education. And I ended up being what I would call a pretty good coach. And I always get frustrated because people tell me, like, oh man, you're a really good startup coach. And I'm like, yeah, and I made not even close to what, when you think of where I was, Eugene, Oregon. The football coach, the volleyball coach, the softball coach, the basketball coach. Guess how much the budget for those 5 coaches was in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon? I mean, it's up to above 12 million a year, I guarantee.
Yeah, massive, no doubt. Yeah.
Guess how much money was devoted to actually employing a entrepreneurial startup coach?
Right.
It's a nice round number. And that's actually the idea that it's a volunteer effort right now. So to sort of scale this up in an effective way, having it be fully volunteer driven is not sustainable. And it's very, very difficult to scale to get anything of any quality, because it's just inconsistent. You actually just don't have the track record of one person engaging over a period of time consistently to know who all the players are and to evolve it effectively and to actually be a good coach. And being a coach that actually is in the middle of it, coaching both investors and startups and then brokering those connections is a very, very difficult thing to do. And very, very rare people, to find them. So I agree that it's necessary. When I think of the companies that we invested in that didn't need any coaching, these are like the guys that came out of guy that came to town, moved from Silicon Valley, had done 2 startups before, was raising money for his 3rd one. He had about, he found money in 20 minutes. He already knew what he was doing. He already kind of had loose connections. He already had some money in. He had a really, really good idea. He knew how to play the game. He had 0 problem raising capital. I think you'll see that across the board. If you have people that are sophisticated and connected, they could probably go anywhere in the nation and raise from any angel group because they already know what's going on.
Yep.
That's really the challenge is, and oftentimes you don't see them actually engaging locally. They come locally, they're trying to engage locally, and they're like, yeah, screw this. I'm just going back to Silicon Valley and talk to my friends and get money from them. I might live here, but my whole capital stream is not going to be local, so they don't actually engage. And this is, you see all these side effects when it comes to coaching, making sure that there's enough of it across the board. And this is particular, to Martin's point, when you're getting angel investors to come to engage, is getting them integrated in a way where you're helping them to learn in a way that's beneficial to them and not sort of talking down to them, and actually providing value to them and not just, hey, I want your money. And then every once in a while you talk to them about investing or how the companies are doing, but basically they're just like, okay, they took my money and now I'm kind of left wondering what the hell's going on. That's not effective relationship building. The flip side of that is I've also been part of groups where we've had 40 angel investors trying to decide on an investment, which like 40 humans trying to decide on absolutely anything doesn't work. The idea, all of them having different opinions about an investment really doesn't work. So all these challenges that they have to sort of run through. Those are my thoughts. I thought that might be somewhat useful. It's like, I agree with you. I just don't see how you can effectively do it in a smaller fund that doesn't have it at scale. At scale, you probably could, but
the answer is governance and best practices, and the because it can and has been done, and we're seeing progress, Joe.
Yeah.
So, but there are no silver bullets. It's not like if you just do this one thing, it works.
Yeah.
It's a combination of a lot of stuff, and it gets down to governance.
Yep.
Expectation setting and governance both. Let me put that way.
I'm even thinking, Mike, like one of the things, how I'm interpreting a lot of that is, and you can tell just from the dynamic of entrepreneurs that we've coached, there's a very big difference in sort of having started out that relationship in a coaching format and then figuring out, oh, they need the fuel, and then continuing that coaching alongside that versus someone who's clearly pitching you for money and then is just at the very least looking to check boxes that you might have about checking in or something like that. Just a wildly different relationship in how that's going to carry forward. Now, scalability is a point there, but I don't know. That was sort of my thinking. It's all right, who are the entrepreneurs that are coming for coaching first, and maybe the funding second.
Yeah, and that, I always come at it as from a leverage standpoint. You get the advantage, and the coaching is a leveraging point, right? That's the point where you gain advantage out in the marketplace, like any arena, that you can potentially get leverage on that simply because you're better at it than others. But needless to say, there's just tons of other variables at play. And I've also seen the other side where it's not coaching, it's just pure brute force, right? There's a winner that's picked in the marketplace by private capital, and they just dump money on it. And very hard to compete with the under-resourced companies will have a very hard time competing with that because the winner's been selected and they just scale. So it's not about coaching at that point, it's just brute force. But in both cases, there's a selection of some winners, right? You're choosing talent. The coach is picking talent to work with, thinking I can coach them. Or you're dumping volumes of dollars on them and picking and just doing it that way and giving them an enormous number of resources and just clearing out the marketplace where there's just not even a close second in terms of resources, and that's going to attract all the talent they need to expand. So it's it's interesting. I don't hear that discussed enough, right? About money, investing strategies, whether it's location or not location, all of that, networking, you name it, right? All that stuff. I just don't hear a lot about, in the end, it's, where are you getting that differential? It's who's given the money, and what are they adding to the mix beyond the money? The money's just sort of table stakes to get them out into the field, but how are you coaching them up? What's the difference there? That's what I'd love to hear. I asked that question.
Well, we are 8 minutes over, so I'm going to let everybody go. But I am going to definitely try and continue this conversation at the very least on Twitter and so forth. Maybe even have a follow-up call because of how much information was coming out of this. I think it's worthwhile. So I know several people have jumped off. Thank you all though for joining. I will be posting the recording, probably even write up a little post just sort of summarizing some of this stuff to share out that you all can join. If you're not already on the email list, well, I think everybody here is already on the email list, but join us on Twitter too. And we'll see you again, hopefully next week, the 10th, 11 a.m. Eastern. We're talking with Ben Revilius out in UK, so it should be fun. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Ed.
Thank
was
you.
awesome, man. Thank you.